I now let Andrea Squartini, I let the question for the end and Andrea, it's your turn.
Hi, thank you. Okay, you see my slide?
Yes, yes.
Okay, so
okay.
the title that Augusto suggested here was The Evolution of Bacteria in Extreme Conditions. And I accepted the challenge. And the other challenge was to do this in 5 minutes. So let's see. Well, when people think about Earth at the beginning of life, a naive way of seeing our planet is a lucky planet in the universe where there were conditions that led life to develop. But it's not the case. Our planet was just like the other ones in the solar system. Here you can see the atmosphere of Earth without life at the beginning. And there were 3,000-fold higher levels of carbon dioxide comparing to today. We are now at 0.04. Actually, slide is getting older, but it used to be 98%. So basically, all the atmosphere was that gas, was CO2. And the temperature shows the corresponding high values, 290 plus minus 50, which does not make big difference. Celsius degrees compared to an average on Earth of 13 degrees today, so 34 higher than today. So it was a bad place, which became a good place just because life took over. And basically photosynthesis made oxygen from cyanobacteria and then plants. And so everything got milder and more mesophilic. And the diagram you see here is the history of the Earth, 4.5 billion years ago of the planet, then about 3.6 billion years ago, the beginning of life. And the black trumpet shape here is the cone of the biodiversity that enlarges with time. So this is about an environment that used to be very hard. Life evolved and made it a place where many forms of life could differentiate and find their niche. And actually, evolution is also about being pushed to evolve because you have competition with other species. To make you an example with human professions, if you want to be a photographer and you go to Siberia, for example, all you need is your camera and maybe you will just work. If you want to be a photographer in Milan with all the stock photography market and all the big shots in photography, you will have to find your niche. You might be the one that photographs all churches of Milan at night, for example, or something like that. So evolution is about having to find your place in an environment which is a good one, but it was not a good one in the beginning. So the bacteria actually did start off their stories in extreme conditions, and then they evolved, but very slowly. Why is that so? One first reason is that bacteria, unfortunately for them, have no sex. So in order to reproduce, they just clone themselves. One cell makes two cells make four, and so on. So it is a very boring thing, but most of all, it is not what brings changes in genetics, because in order to have variation, you need to count only on mutations, which is passive, or occasionally on gene transfer from another species, if it happens. And the problem is that if you are aiming at evolution, so having mutations, DNA, you need to replicate your genome, because it is when you replicate DNA that you might have mistakes, which are changes. And those mistakes can bring bad things or good things. And the good ones are selected by the environment selection. But the paradox here is that if you start in an extreme environment, cell divisions, which you will need to have mutations, are rare because the environment is stressful. So life is limited by the starting condition. It's like a catch-22 situation. So if you have a DNA sequence like this bacterial gene, the 16S ribosomal RNA, which is the basis of distinguishing species nowadays, if there is an identical sequence, but then there is one mutation, see this C is red, now it's changed, you had an event that takes a lot of time. One single nucleotide change in this gene takes 4.4 million years. And in order to be two different species, you need a lot of those changes in that molecule. So now you have a lot of red letters. And when the divergence is over 2.5%, which is 38 nucleotides over 1,500 of this molecule, then those are considered to be nowadays two different species. But keep in mind that this took a lot of time, like 166 million years, meaning that today's species originated in Jurassic age. So the evolution is slow for bacteria. The second and last reason is that if you are living in a hard environment, you are risking a lot if you change anything. So if you are surviving an extreme place, you don't want to change, or you don't want to risk changes. And my metaphor here is our proverb, squadra che vince non si cambia. You don't change any player in a winning team. And in the World Cup in 1970 in Mexico, this was our idea. And our strategy was the so-called catenaccio, the defense. But if you have to cope with the stress, like a factor, which could be low oxygen, high temperature, salt, drought, low carbon, low energy, the end point is that not many species can coexist, as we saw before, or even just one can endure the harsh environment, because that species happens to have a phenotype which is the right one. So why changing? Why mutating? And this is a strong caveat for evolution. Although in Mexico, fantasy instead of defense was the winning strategy, and Brazil won that World Cup. But bacteria evolved nevertheless by having a little fantasy and a little risks. And the bacteria that evolved less actually are called the archaea. And you see that they still live in hard environments, and their branches are very short compared to the ones of bacteria that live in permissive and mesophilic and mild environments. And then we see ourselves. And we also have to keep in mind that bacteria did evolve into us, ourselves. We are the progeny of an old bacterium, LUCA, last universal common ancestor. And the other thing which is important is that bacteria evolved into plants, animals, and eukaryotes in general, but also a lot of them stayed bacteria, stayed prokaryotes with no sex, and the other way of surviving, because that has to be important. And the other important consideration is that soil and the world as we know it was not around when we differentiated the eukaryotic branches that then led to animals, fungi, and higher plants. 500 million years ago, plants just started to colonize land, and this was a situation. Look at the CO2 was still very high, more than tenfold today's ranges. And there were no roots, no soils, and no land plants at that time. And about bacteria, I said the species evolved 166 million years ago, but the phyla, the things that correspond for our case to the chordate, we are a phylum chordate, for example, and the phyla for bacteria are the ones you see here. All those phyla already originated a couple of billion years ago. So when the climate was the worst that we ever knew. And the final consideration is that climate is warning us and sending a message, because it is becoming hotter, drier, more extreme, as it used to be in the past. We've been into a climate that was bad. And so it is as if we were going back in time. And science fiction and H.G. Wells had imagined another way to travel back in time for humans, the time machine. And it wasn't exactly what's happening to climate. However, we are going back to a climate that, if it goes all the way, and we hope not, it will bring us to a condition in which the lineages of the bacteria that are still surviving did evolve. They had a chance. So rather than fearing the future, we should think about going home, going back to a place where we've been before, but in a very different shape. And that's why I think rather than talking about evolution, we might consider involution to be on the safe side and become bacteria once again for the sake of microbiologists. Okay, that's it. And I thank you.
Whoa, thank you, Andrea.
I hope I kept the time, and that was it.